The corridors of Versailles have always known echoes, of silk dragging across marble, of laughter spilling from salons, of fountains sighing through open windows. But on the morning of September 1st, 1715, the palace learned a new sound: silence. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had finally set. For 72 years he had ruled a kingdom that mistook his breath for its own. When it stopped, all of France seemed to forget how to breathe. In the royal bedchamber, candles trembled in their sockets. Courtiers pressed lace to their faces, pretending it was grief and not fear that made them tremble. The doctors, who had sworn the king immortal, stood useless beside the bed, their hands smelling of mercury and prayer. Outside, the fountains of the Grand Canal had been ordered to cease. Water no longer leapt toward heaven. Versailles itself seemed to bow. At the hour of his death, etiquette demanded the announcement be whispered 3 times: "Le roi est mort." Only then came the second phrase: "Vive le roi." But the next king was a frightened 5-year-old, and even the courtiers could not pretend eternity had been inherited. That night, the palace swallowed its reflections. Mirrors clouded, clocks halted, draperies were drawn as though mourning the sun. From the chapel came the scent of melting wax, and the low murmur of clergy reading psalms over a body that had once believed itself divine. The man who had built Versailles as proof of his immortality now lay within it, like an exhibit of futility. Far beyond the gilded gates, Paris waited. Peasants whispered that the tyrant's death would free them. Nobles feared it would free the mob instead. Yet for one night both high and low shared the same emotion: dread of the silence that follows a god's departure. When dawn returned, black crape shrouded every lamp along the hall of mirrors. The palace servants moved barefoot, their steps absorbed by carpets thick as snow. Versailles, built for spectacle, had become a mausoleum draped in gold. The king's body lay upon the catafalque beneath a canopy embroidered with suns. Beside him, the courtiers knelt not in devotion, but in disbelief. No one spoke aloud the thought that trembled in every throat: if the Sun King could die, then so could the world that orbited him. That morning, the grandest stage in Europe dimmed its lights. The reign of splendor had ended, leaving only candle smoke rising into silence. They embalmed him as if preserving daylight. The surgeons moved with ritual precision, slicing through the illusion of divinity one layer at a time. Perfumed oils, salt, and wine were poured into wounds that had once signed edicts. The heart was removed, placed in a crystal urn, and sent to the Jesuit church in Paris. His entrails went to Notre Dame. His body remained in Versailles, swaddled in linen, stitched with gold thread. They divided the Sun King as though France itself could not bear the weight of his whole corpse. In the chapel, choirs murmured litanies drowned by the echo of hammering carpenters building the coffin. It was carved from oak, lined with lead, heavy enough to outlast its occupant. Over it hung banners embroidered with fleur-de-lis, now dulled to grey. The courtiers entered one by one to kneel before the body, whispering praise that sounded like apology. Outside, Versailles dimmed itself. The great mirrors were veiled, fountains shut down. Musicians of the royal orchestra laid down their instruments, strings unwound so they would not snap from neglect. The gardens, once choreographed by sunlight, withered in early autumn, statues sweating dew like tears. The procession left the palace at nightfall. Torches burned low to save wax, their flames pale and wavering in the damp air. 6 black horses drew the hearse, their manes powdered white with ash. Around them, guards marched with inverted pikes. Behind, the clergy sang De Profundis into a wind that refused to carry the notes. From the villages along the route to Saint-Denis, peasants emerged to watch the passing of magnificence. They crossed themselves without knowing whether it was reverence or superstition. Children whispered that the king's coffin glowed from within. Old men spat, saying they had served him in war and owed him no tears. Yet none turned away. For all his cruelty, he had been their horizon. Now it had vanished. When the cortege reached the gates of Saint-Denis, The monks tolled the bells once, then stopped. The abbey's vault, where every Bourbon slept in gilded stone, yawned open. The coffin descended slowly, the ropes groaning under its weight. Candles guttered, and wax dripped like molten gold. The sound of the lid sealing was dull, final, terrifyingly human. In that moment, France ceased pretending her king was a god. The sun had been buried in darkness, and even Versailles could not outshine the grave. The palace that once pulsed with orchestras now breathed only dust. Versailles, that glittering theater of absolutism, had lost its actor, its script, its reason to shine. Servants moved like sleepwalkers, extinguishing lamps one by one until the chandeliers became cages of shadow. The marble floors, polished for decades by the dance of courtiers, dulled beneath the quiet shuffle of mourning shoes. Protocol demanded that nothing joyous be heard within the estate. Music was forbidden, laughter treasonous. The Queen's apartments remained locked, the Dauphin's toys untouched. Even the fountains outside were silenced, their still water reflecting a sky the color of lead. Versailles was a monument to motion, but now it stood perfectly still, as if holding its breath for permission to continue existing. Those who had worshipped the Sun King lingered in corridors, uncertain whom to orbit now. Ministers who once rose with the dawn waited in vain for an audience that would never be granted again. The king's mistresses wept behind closed doors, careful not to let the tears ruin their rouge. Grief was expected to be elegant. Pages polished doorknobs already spotless, desperate to remain useful. Etiquette persisted even when purpose was gone. Beyond the gilded gates, the rumor of his death rippled outward. In Paris, candles were burned in windows not from love, but habit. Merchants draped their stalls in black cloth. Actors refused to perform tragedies, fearing life had outdone their craft. The common folk waited for miracles that never came. Rain that would wash away debt, bread that would return to tables. Instead, they received silence, that most expensive of luxuries. Inside the palace, the mortuary guards kept vigil beside the empty throne. They whispered of strange sounds at night, the faint echo of music from distant halls, the rustle of silk when no one was near. Some claimed to see a glimmer of sunlight creeping beneath the chapel doors, though the windows were boarded. He walks still, they said. No one dared correct them. To admit the king was truly gone was to admit the end of certainty itself. Each dawn, priests filed through the hall of mirrors to sprinkle holy water that steamed faintly on the cold glass. The reflections returned distorted, as if the mirrors themselves were in mourning. They said when Louis XIV ruled, even the mirrors obeyed him, catching light where he stood. Now they caught only absence. Weeks passed, and the court began to rot behind its etiquette. Gossip replaced purpose. Jewels glimmered like guilt. The grandeur that had once blinded Europe now exposed its own fragility. Versailles was magnificent only while pretending eternity. At night, the palace creaked like a ship adrift on dark water. Somewhere, behind a locked door, a clock ticked on, refusing to grieve. But everyone else knew. The rhythm it kept was not life, but the slow count of an empire learning how to die. At dawn on September 2nd, 1715, the funeral procession prepared to leave Versailles. The morning fog was thick enough to blur the gilded statues, turning the gardens into a field of ghosts. It was as if even the marble refused to watch the Sun King depart. The coffin, heavy with lead and legend, waited within the courtyard. Around it, guards stood at attention, their halberds inverted in silent salute. The horses, black and anxious, stamped their hooves against the cobblestones, each breath a cloud of frost. Courtiers whispered blessings they did not believe. No one dared to meet another's eyes, fear that grief might look like relief. At the appointed hour, the trumpeters lifted their instruments, then lowered them again. Music had been forbidden. The cortege began instead, with the rhythm of boots against stone, an army of mourning feet. The great gates of Versailles opened slowly, their hinges groaning like the palace itself protesting abandonment. Through the mist they went, a river of torches flowing into the countryside. Behind the hearse rode priests chanting psalms too softly to carry. The sound of the wheels grinding over gravel mixed with the rustle of mourning veils. Villagers lined the roads, bowing as the cortege passed. Some wept, others watched with blank faces, too long accustomed to hunger to shed tears for a king who had never known want. The route wound north towards Saint-Denis, where every Bourbon before him slept. Yet even the road itself seemed to resist. The horses stumbled, the torches sputtered. In the distance, thunder murmured across the plains of Ile-de-France. An old peasant crossed himself and whispered, "The sky does not want him back." When night fell, the cortege halted at a monastery. The monks opened their gates, and for a few hours, the king rested among the living poor. One monk later wrote in his diary, "We did not see the sun, but we felt his shadow." By the second dawn, the procession reached the necropolis. The bells of Saint-Denis tolled once, no fanfare, no echo. Inside the abbey, candlelight trembled across the marble tombs of centuries. The coffin was lowered into the crypt, where kings slept in stone crowns. As it descended, the ropes creaked, shedding dust from ceilings carved with angels that looked away. When the final prayer was spoken, the abbot closed the vault with a single strike of his staff. The sound reverberated like a heartbeat, then faded. No one applauded. The courtiers simply stood there, hollow-eyed, realizing that without their monarch, they too were ghosts of a vanished order. Outside, dawn broke again over Versailles, but the sunlight that returned was pale, timid, and mortal. The procession was over. The age of divine kings had ended its march. When the cortege vanished into history, Versailles tried to return to life, but the air refused to forget. The courtiers came back in their jeweled mourning clothes, whispering in corridors now too wide for their voices. The new king, a frail child named Louis XV, was carried through the same halls on the same crimson carpet, his small shoes sinking into the footprints of the dead. Every reflection seemed to look not at him, but at the ghost of the man who had filled the world with his shadow. The mirrors, veiled in black crape, absorbed more than candlelight. They absorbed memory. When servants tried to polish them, they claimed to see movement behind their own reflections, glimpses of a figure in brocade, a gloved hand resting on an invisible cane. Fear made superstition sound like faith. The court began speaking of le revenant du roi, the returning king. No one laughed. In Versailles, belief had become the last form of loyalty. The great fountains remained off. Without the roar of water, the palace sounded hollow, its silence interrupted only by wind moving through empty salons. Marble floors cracked in the winter cold. In the chapel, priests prayed for the soul of Louis XIV, though none dared mention that the prayers sounded more like apologies. Those who had once been closest to him found their fortunes collapsing as swiftly as his reign had ended. Mistresses were dismissed, ministers exiled, soldiers unpaid. The sun had not only illuminated them, it had blinded them. Without him, they stumbled through corridors of gold that now gleamed like mockery. At night, the palace seemed to breathe. Doors opened on their own, curtains trembled, and the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the hall of mirrors. Guards reported hearing the faint strains of a harpsichord playing Marche pour le sacre du roi Soleil, a melody that no one dared perform. Once, a page fainted, claiming he saw the chandeliers ignite themselves, every crystal flame burning without wax. In truth, it was not ghosts that haunted Versailles. It was memory refusing to decay. The palace had been built as a mirror of its master, every corridor a reflection of his vanity, every garden a map of his control. Now the architecture itself grieved. Versailles was alive, but hollowed, like a shell from which the sea had withdrawn. By spring, the court returned to its games, laughter forced and shrill. Music echoed once more through the galleries, yet something in its rhythm faltered, as though every note waited for a conductor who would never lift his hand again. Even sunlight, once the king's emblem, entered the windows cautiously, uncertain whether it was still welcome. Versailles glittered again, but the sparkle was that of glass left in darkness, cold, brittle, and ready to break. The death of Louis XIV did not end at Saint-Denis. It lingered like perfume in old curtains, seeping through generations that could not name its scent. France still moved, but clumsily, like a body learning to walk without a spine. Versailles, that gilded organism he had created, continued to breathe, though each breath sounded more like a sigh. The child king, Louis XV, grew beneath chandeliers dimmed by memory. Ministers spoke of reform, but every idea carried the weight of a ghost. The people still bowed to portraits of the Sun King. His statue survived every frost, every political quarrel. He had built his immortality too well. The kingdom that had worshipped light now feared its absence. Across Europe, envoys wrote home that France had grown quiet. The once mighty court entertained fewer visitors. The gardens went untrimmed. Artists complained the air no longer inspired them. Even the fashion of mourning, black silk trimmed with jet beads, outlived the reason for grief. The sun had set, yet the shadows remained. In Paris, pamphlets appeared, mocking the cost of the late king's glory. They called Versailles a temple to vanity built upon hunger. Yet the same voices wept when the royal hearse was remembered. The contradiction was the country itself, devout and defiant, proud and hollow. A priest in Saint-Sulpice wrote, "France walks in daylight, but her soul keeps vigil by candlelight." Decades passed. The young king became old. Wars drained the treasury. The people's patience thinned. The palace remained beautiful but increasingly irrelevant, a museum of obedience. When rain fell on the marble roofs, the gutters sang like dirges. Visitors spoke of hearing whispers from the crypts of Saint-Denis, as if the bones of monarchs debated whether France still belonged to them. The Enlightenment arrived, bringing questions sharper than swords. Philosophers laughed at the idea of divine right. Poets called Versailles a mirror too heavy for its reflection. But none dared close the palace. To destroy it would be to admit that the age of gods had truly ended, and men still feared a world without one. By the late 18th century, the descendants of the Sun King danced beneath chandeliers while Paris starved. The same mirrors that once reflected immortality now showed the cracks of decay. In those reflections waited revolution. The pit that had swallowed a king's body centuries earlier had not closed. It had merely changed its name. When the revolution finally came, the tombs of Saint-Denis were broken open. Bones were scattered, jewels stolen, hearts crushed beneath boots. The Sun King's coffin was torn apart, his remains mixed with the soil of his enemies. The echo that had haunted Versailles for 75 years was silenced, not by reverence, but by rage. France had finally buried its god. The monarchy's afterlife ended where its first heartbeat began, in the dust. Today, Versailles gleams once more. Its mirrors are polished, its fountains sing again, and tourists move through its corridors whispering admiration. Yet beneath the gold, something mournful lingers. Every echo in those halls belongs to a century that died believing it could not. The chandeliers dazzle, but their light feels borrowed, as though the palace still waits for its master to return and remind it how to shine. The Sun King's motto, Nec pluribus impar, not unequal to many suns, still adorns the ceilings, but it no longer commands the heavens. The sun he worshipped has long set behind revolutions, empires, and republics. What remains is a silence more enduring than glory, the silence of consequence. Versailles stands as the most beautiful tomb in Europe, a mausoleum disguised as triumph. Visitors look upon the Hall of Mirrors and see elegance, not confession. They do not hear the echoes of hoofbeats from that last funeral procession, or the sound of ropes creaking as a coffin descended into the dark. They see reflections of themselves and mistake it for history. But if you stand still long enough, just long enough, you can sense the faint hum behind the marble, the whisper of an empire that once believed sunlight could be commanded. The revolution shattered the illusion, but not the architecture. The palace survived kings, emperors, and wars because it was built not of stone, but of belief. Each column, each fresco, is a prayer carved by pride. And though the faith it served has vanished, the prayer endures. The air itself seems to repeat it. I was eternal. I was eternal. At Saint-Denis, where the tombs were rebuilt, the Sun King's bones lie in anonymity among those of his descendants. The vault is quiet, but the legend persists. Some nights, when the moonlight touches the abbey roof, locals say the air grows warmer, as if the sun, for a heartbeat, remembers where it once slept. Versailles, too, remembers. It remembers the day the fountains stopped, the mirrors wept, and the courtiers realized they were only men. It remembers the slow march of horses through fog and the child who inherited a crown too heavy for innocence. It remembers the silence after music ends. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of kings, not their palaces or wars, but the hush they leave behind when the spectacle is over. The kind of silence that teaches us how fragile reverence can be and how quickly eternity becomes memory. If this story followed you into the dark tonight, let it stay. Leave a thought for the light that once believed itself immortal. And if you wish to keep walking through the ruins of forgotten grandeur, subscribe and step deeper into the labyrinth of lost truths, because some suns never rise again, but their shadows still burn.